So excited to introduce today's session. I'm Alan Yarborough. I do some communication support for the Episcopal Parish Network, in addition to my main job with the Office of Government Relations. Excited to learn from these two on the topic of Christian nationalism and the church's response. The Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis and the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas really have a lot in store for us to also serve as a foundation for the upcoming keynote conversation that is happening at the annual conference in Houston with Dr. Sam Perry, the Reverend Russ Levenson, and the Very Reverend Owen Thompson. So that'll take place on March 8th at 1:30. I hope that folks can join us in Houston for that program as well. But without further ado, I will turn it over to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and I thank the Episcopal Church Network for inviting me and my colleague, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, to engage with you on this very important topic of white Christian nationalism. Liz and I recently taught a course on this very topic, white Christian nationalism. What is it and what to do about it, or how we might respond to it, particularly as we find ourselves in this time of election season with an upcoming election. And so Episcopal Divinity School, along with the Kairos Center, sponsored this. And so we are happy to share some of our conversations and with you today. And so I will get started, and I will do this by sharing my screen with you. And then, great. Thank you, Liz gives me the thumbs up because I am a Luddite at this stuff. And so thank you, my friend. But let's get started. Christian nationalism. The first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is it? There are so many folks that say we don't even know what it is and what it looks like. We hope to at least give you a few pegs to hang your hat on in regard to understanding what it is, what it looks like, where it comes from, and what we might be able to do about it. It is a cultural framework that blurs distinctions between Christian identity and American identity. Keep that in mind. Viewing the two as closely related, and seeking to enhance and preserve their union, the union between those two, Christian identity and American identity. This is taken from Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead's book, Taking America Back for God. From Amanda Tyler of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, she says that Christian nationalism carries with it assumptions about nativism, American identity, white supremacy, again, American identity, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. These things usually always go together. Note that. Then from Kevin Singer, president of Neighborly Faith, a movement advancing a vision of America's past, present, and future that excludes people of non-Christian religions and non-Western cultures. Now, one of the very important things in this definition that's building on the others, American identity, white supremacy, nativism, etc., is the word excludes. Christian nationalism itself, and we'll see why it's white Christian nationalism, is not typically oppositional and exclusive. It doesn't draw people in, rather it pushes people out. It excludes people from American identity. Then finally, the Public Religion and Research Institute, along with the Brookings in a recent survey that they did, defined Christian nationalism this way: a religious and political system that believes the United States was founded by God to be a Christian nation. So these four definitions kind of give us all, saying in a different way, a capsule understanding of what we mean when we're talking about Christian nationalism. Well, how did we get here? How did we get to this place in this country where Christian nationalism has become so problematic and has taken over, if you will, the public square, the religious, the political, the social public square? What makes us vulnerable as a nation to Christian nationalism? Then we'll talk about what makes us vulnerable as Christianity. There is a cultural, social, economic vulnerability. What is that social cultural vulnerability? John Friedman, the chair of the economics department at Brown University, has said this: when people feel like they don't have a chance, or perhaps even more dangerously, when they feel like their kids don't have a chance, that inequality of opportunity is really what gets people upset. When we think about the danger to our democracy, we typically are talking about that in terms of individuals, candidates that are running for office, or whatever the case may be. But the true danger to any democracy is inequality. Inequality seeds the soil for things like Christian nationalism, white supremacy to grow. And so, and as it does that, it seeds the soil for people to emerge that create fear in those who feel that they have been left behind. As Friedman has said, it seeds the soil for scapegoating, to blame other people for the position and predicament that we're in. Again, remember this Christian nationalism, American identity. You can blame those others who aren't, quote unquote, true Americans for your predicament. That's what, when you're on the bottom, that's the soil for other people to step in and seed your fears and begin to scapegoat. And then they position themselves, right, as the savior that can bring you ultimate salvation from all that is wrong with America, so that, again, you indeed will be able to rise and take advantage of the opportunities of the American dream. So inequality, social, cultural, economic inequality, that is the greatest danger to democracy. And it opens the way for something like white Christian nationalism to emerge and for it to grow. So here's what we know. 66.6% of the total wealth in this country is owned by 10% of its earners. We also know the lowest 50% of earners only owned 2.6% of the nation's wealth. 50% of the lowest earners in this country only own 2.6%. And then get this, and as my colleague Liz, who works with the Poor People's Campaign and Kairos, will tell you, we really don't have a middle class anymore. So the top 1% of American earners now control more wealth than the nation's entire middle class. Again, culturally, socially, economically, this is the soil that allows for the fertilization and the growth of white Christian nationalism, inequality, the inequality gap. Now, so what about Christianity? How in the world did we get here that we have to defend ourselves, if you will, from this narrative of Christian nationalism that has overtaken, if you will, the public square in terms of how to think of Christianity? I'm going to move quickly here. There are three things about Christianity that are embedded in our sort of theological, if you will, architecture, in the fabric of Christian religion. I'm just going to state these quickly. You will be able to, I hope, put it together. One, we are, as we all know, a monotheistic religion. We believe in one God, the God of Jesus Christ. We are not the only monotheistic religion. Judaism is monotheistic. Islam faith tradition is monotheistic. And perhaps there are others. I'm just talking about those three sort of major religions, if you will. And so, but when we think of Christianity, something happened with Christianity's monotheism way back as it was this minority religion in the Hellenistic world, the Roman Greek world, that it became what I call a closed monotheism. That is, not only did it demand that its inherents only believe in one God, that's fine, but it then suggested that there were no other gods in the universe, that the Christian God was the God, the one true God. Keep that. What happens when you believe that only your God? This is the foundation for a nationalistic kind of religion, is the God. When your God is the God, it doesn't matter if you aren't in power, right? We'll wait in a minute. Then the other thing that happens, that allows for this notion of individual, private kind of salvation, as opposed to some social kind of salvation. You know, it's this notion that Jesus just came to save individual souls and not move us toward a more just world, a more just society, but saving everyone from their pietistic sins. There was this soul body split that happened around that same time in Christianity. Became a part. Some people blame it on Paul. It happened before Paul. It became a part of Christianity's theological architecture, again, laying the possible foundation for what we see today. And then there's this thing. Christianity started out as a religion of, well, the oppressed. Jesus, as Howard Thurman, theologian, once said, was one with the disinherited. Constantine got converted in 312. Some of us say, that's when it all went wrong, because then Christianity became a religion of power. It became the religion of the empire. And so now it could enforce that it's a closed monotheism. There's one God. When Christianity came together with power, that begins this legacy of Christian nationalism. The cross, as one author, James Carroll, said, became a sword. Now let us move quickly. So now here we have making of white Christian nationalism in the United States. Remember what I said about American identity, white supremacy? We get white Christian nationalism because two narratives will collide and have collided and have come together in this country. This narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, that's white supremacy, white identity, I'll go into it in a minute, manifest destiny, this notion that our God, right? Our God is calling us to rule the world. So how does, and Liz, give me a thumbs up when if I go much too longer. So what do we know about what I call Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, or what we really know is American exceptionalism, and this notion of American identity that has so become white supremacy, and what American identity is a raced identity, raced white. Where did that come from? Way early on, there was in the first century world a philosopher named Tacitus, who talked about, he discovered this, what he said, a distinct, unmixed race of people like none other, who resided in the ancient woods of Germany, wrote a book called Germania. Some say it's the most dangerous book ever. And he said that these people who identified as Anglo-Saxon, he said that these people were superior in virtue, and that they had a particular love that no one else had for freedom, and that they were virtuous, moral, with this particular love of freedom. And so everyone wanted to imitate sort of the governmental sort of structures and societal structures of this people, but also, right, identify with the people who are so perfect in virtue, etc. The great Anglo-Saxons. Well, skipping along in history, guess who said that they were indeed the sort of carrying forth the legacy, the inheritors, could trace, if you will, their DNA. They didn't do that then, but the point is could trace their roots to this virtuous group of Anglo-Saxons that were in the ancient woods of Germany that Germania that was talked about in Tacitus' books, Germania. The Pilgrims and the Puritans. It is one of the reasons that they fled England, because they felt that England had indeed compromised. The English had compromised their great, pure Anglo-Saxon identity. And so they started out on a voyage. And guess what they wanted to do on that voyage? They wanted to carry forth an Anglo-Saxon heritage and build the perfect city on a hill. And it is here that they began to identify themselves. This is the beginning of Manifest Destiny. They began to identify themselves as the new Israelites, right? Carrying forth the mission of God, crossing over the Atlantic like crossing the Red Sea, the Exodus from England to carry forth this Anglo-Saxon heritage. So, as the Mayflower Compact made clear, they are having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of Christian faith in the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Note that, glory of God and advancement of Christian faith. And then we have John Winthrop right on the ship, the Arabella, that he declares we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause God to withdraw God's present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world. What's the point being made here? The beginning of Manifest Destiny, the new Israelites. Who are the new Israelites? Carrying forth the mission of their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. They are trying to build an Anglo-Saxon, perfect Anglo-Saxon city on a hill, nation, world. And lest you think that, no one listened to John Winthrop and the Pilgrims and the Puritans, etc. But they did, because both Benjamin Franklin, John, Thomas Jefferson, great Anglophiles, particularly Thomas Jefferson, and they proposed an original seal for America that had Anglo-Saxon gods on one side, and of course the exodus of the Israelites on the other. So, and then we get the full-blown sort of notion of Manifest Destiny in 1845, really when the country went to really began to try to capture different lands. And they said it is our, meaning white people's, God-given right to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific and acquire the entire continent. Right, the right of our manifest destiny to spread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given unto us. That, my friends, is the historical foundation built into our DNA in our understanding of who we are as a nation. Built into the fabric of this country's identity is the notion that we are indeed a nation called by God to indeed be a beacon of what it means to be this great city on a hill doing the work of God. And all of that is under the framework of being a quote unquote Christian nation. And we see the roots of that. And so you see what has come together is this notion of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, white supremacy, which it will morph into, along with this notion of being the new Israelites, which warps into Manifest Destiny. And that provides the foundation for what we see today as white Christian nationalism. And as I have pointed out, Christianity has things in it that makes it vulnerable. Doesn't mean it has to go that way, but makes it vulnerable to that. So let me end here. So are we just talking nonsense? How many people really in this country, come on, are actually white Christian nationalism? How prevalent is that in this country? And by the way, it is always important to talk about white Christian nationalism because that's what it is. And so how prevalent is it? The Public Religion and Research Institute and their surveys have been supported by Pew Survey, Pew Studies, and other studies. A third of Americans, or 29%, qualify as Christian nationalists. Then keep that in mind, a third, which means they're adherents or they're sympathizers to it. Of that third, 2/3 define themselves as white evangelicals. Not surprising, right? We've seen that. Among white evangelical Protestants, nearly 2/3 are either Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers, right? More than half of one of our two major parties, more than half of Republicans now identify as Christian nationalists or sympathizers to it. And so what we find is that a minority of people, only a third of people in this country, think about that, a minority of people now make their political power much greater than their actual numbers in the population. You follow that? So that more than half of Republicans identify as Christian nationalists, when only a third of the people in this nation identify as Christian nationalists. So that political power of white Christian nationalists has outsized their numbers in the actual population. And we can see sort of the breakdown of what that means in terms of white evangelical Protestants, et cetera. Now, and I'm just going to get ready to turn this over to Liz, because what that means for us is this. If only a third of Americans truly identify as white Christian nationalists, then that means a decided minority of Americans are controlling the Christian narrative, even as they are controlling the public square. That means 2/3 of Christians who don't adhere to Christian nationalism are allowing a third to control the narrative of what it means to be Christian and control the narrative on the public square. We'll talk about, Liz will talk about how we regain that. But what that means to me is that it challenges us now, right? To in fact be church and to begin to reshape the narrative. And so that there is resistance to the notion that to be Christian is to be a white Christian nationalist. So I will stop there and turn it over to my colleague, Liz Theoharis.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. You always amaze me, and really appreciate the work you just did and the work you do in the world. We need a whole lot more of you in order to be able to come together as people of faith and Christians in particular to resist and to confront these really formidable and dangerous forces in our society today. So what I'm hoping to do is continue the conversation. It's really helpful. We need a definition. You know, I think about someone like Reverend Dr. King saying that you can only get a proper prescription for the disease when you have an accurate diagnosis. And so we need to start with what is going on, and then move to a question about what we must do in the face of all of it. So what I want us to spend a little time on is some of the kind of heretical theology, but mostly then the practical steps that it's going to take for us to really, as people of faith and people in communities, to come together and confront these forces. We often will hear in our politics, I and I alone can fix your problems. God's not on top anymore. Jesus never told Caesar to help the poor. But if we look back into the Bible, even in a passage like Matthew 25, Jesus makes it clear that whole societies, ethne in the Greek text, are subject to his instruction. They're not suggestions for just how individual people are supposed to conduct ourselves, but codes for how to structure a nation to ensure inclusion, community prosperity, and to mitigate against forces of suffering and violence, and things like white Christian nationalism. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah echo Deuteronomy and Leviticus in insisting that obedience to God means not leaving care for the vulnerable to the whims of the wealthy and powerful. And so I want us to be thinking about this theologically as we then get ready to figure out what kind of practical steps we're going to take in our society and in our congregations today. When we think about what ways that the Bible and theology are being twisted, and especially ways that the church and Christians have been dragged into what is going on in our society today, I think we do well to go back to that inaugural sermon of Jesus's in his hometown of Nazareth in Luke 4, where he announces that God has set him apart to preach good news to the Patokos, those who have been made poor and by injustice and unjust practices and systems. It's an explicit declaration that he has come to make a social and economic argument to contemporary leaders. And I think when we don't start there in our responses, we often are not actually taking seriously the problems. It's kind of like Jeremiah 6. They address the wounds of my people as if they're not serious. Well, this problem of white Christian nationalism is deeply serious, and we are going to have to figure out what we can do to address it. So I want to share my screen and talk you all through a little bit of a presentation, especially about what it means for us to be countering white Christian nationalism and this false god of nationalism. So this past spring, the Kairos Center that I direct, along with the Move On Education Fund, and a cohort of different leaders, particularly people of faith, put together a report called All of Us, Organizing to Counter White Christian Nationalism and Build a Pro-Democracy Society. And I want to talk us through a couple of the different recommendations and strategies that we put out in this report, because I really believe that if we're going to take seriously what Kelly was just putting out of an assessment and analysis of the situation and the hold that it has on our theology and politics, that it's going to take organizing. It's going to take organizing. And so how do we do this? I want to suggest that first, what we need to do is actually meet people's material, spiritual, and emotional needs. This is something we know to do in churches, and yet if we go back to what Kelly was just saying, that a small number of people have kind of captured the imagination of our society. When we look at where there's the concentration of politicians and policies that are influenced by white Christian nationalism, you can also see the confluence of lots of different congregations and churches in the mix. And the question is, are people meeting people's material, emotional, and spiritual needs? In so many cases, folk that are more inclusive, are more about justice, are more about lifting the load of poverty, are not always in a position to be leveraging and incorporating already what we're doing, whether it's a soup kitchen or a food pantry, whether it's a prayer service for the unemployed or a debt relief group of congregants. This is some of what we have to do. We also have to address these human needs for connection, for spiritual nourishment, for a sense of belonging as a part of the kind of organizing work, the kind of meeting people where they're at work that we're going to do and we need to do as people and people of faith. We need to make sure that our faith communities and faith leaders from our communities are a part of a larger pro-democracy movement. As we opened up this session, this election is a very important one, and we will never tell people who they should vote for, but we do need to hear that our votes and our voices matter, and we need to bring them into being this coming fall. And this is a place where our congregations and our faith communities need to be a part of an ecosystem that is promoting democracy, and not autocracy. We need in this nation, and I see congregations from all across the country present with us this afternoon, but we need to be prioritizing local organizing, reaching out into rural areas, into parts of the Midwest and South, into states where there are localities and politicians that are aligned with white Christian nationalism. And we need to not concede any place, any people, to fall prey to this dangerous and heretical theological position. And we need to leverage elections to build a pro-democracy movement, and not sit out, not think that our votes don't matter, not think that that this is not as serious as it really is, and not think that the separation of church and state means that people of faith can't go out and participate in the election process. We need to claim a long arc moral vision that includes everyone and develop compelling narratives that carry forward that vision. Now, I come from a community, and I have many relatives that have fallen prey to a more exclusive, more autocratic narrative and vision for the society. But it's not what they want, it's what they're given. And so how do we instead, as people of faith, put out a larger moral vision? And how, as Christians, do we come alongside other Christians and organize them and actually see that winning hearts and minds towards a pro-democratic, inclusive, and just society is actually what it is for us to follow Jesus Christ? We need to be organizing people across all of the historic lines of division in this country. This means organizing people across race, including and especially having white folk join with people of color for a strategic kind of organizing drive, including in rural, poor, and working class communities. That question of inequality that Kelly was talking about earlier, we cannot concede anybody, including poor white folk, to folk that have ideology of white nationalism and Christian nationalism, because we can, in fact, win and organize people across these historic lines of division. We're seeing it happen. And so I just wanted to put out a couple of those recommendations. I want us to think a little bit here about what then that means. That means in our congregations, we should be having Bible studies in Sunday school that are focused on some of these issues. We should be having sermon series that take up the problem and heresy of racism and inequality. We should have our youth programming focused on these issues. We should have all of our local congregations aware of what the denomination is doing and connecting people through things like this Episcopal Parish Network. We should get involved and connected to local organizations and efforts in our communities and our states. We can get involved in actions on a state and a national level. You can sign up to be a part of different programs and networks of congregations that are trying to resist white Christian nationalism. And we can indeed kind of cry for justice and freedom in this world and in this society, and not concede our religion and our communities to hate and fear and exclusion and poverty. And so I want us to pause here so we have a little time. I've seen some different questions coming in, and I think we're gonna at this point be able to entertain a bunch of those thoughts and questions. I think it was announced at the beginning. Please please jump in and pose some questions, and the two of us are going to start fielding them now.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And I'll answer a couple of the first questions I've seen, and then also turn it over to you. And questions I might have missed because it's scrolling quickly in chat. One question that I saw early on was, are we saying that Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism are the same, are synonymous? I think, and in the context, our context and this country, I think, yes, we have to hold those two things together. That, first of all, let me say, as many of you know, that Christian nationalism is not peculiar to the United States. That Christian nationalism is showing up across the globe, particularly in Europe, where we have these what are called populist kind of movements. And that is these movements where people, not unlike in the United States, are becoming very nativist, if you will, in their particular nation's identity, which typically means that that identity is being defined in such a way that is excluding and exclusive of typically people of color, people from the African diaspora in particular, and also people of Southeast Asia and from that diaspora. So these populist movements are global. We see that. And Christianity, when Christianity provides the sacred canopy, the legitimating theological religious canopy for that, then we have this notion of Christian nationalism. Whiteness comes together so easily with this narrative of Christian nationalism because we're talking about the reality of what in this country is becoming a minority people, but have been majoritized, the people of power, right? And so what we're seeing is Christianity coming together with power. That goes way back, as I said, to Constantine. That's that legacy. Coming together with power in this country, we're talking about white supremacist power, coming together with that in such a way now to legitimate a white supremacist narrative and to say, in essence, that that narrative is God's narrative. Again, so if we're going to get to the root and really understand the way Christian nationalism is functioning in this country, yes, indeed, we have to understand the way these two narratives have collided and given us white Christian nationalism. The last thing that I'll say to a question that came after that, and from Liz's presentation, there was the question of we are told not to be political activists as religious leaders in our churches. There are various surveys, Pew Studies, as well as Brookings Institute, as well as Public Religion and Research Institute, that have said that people want to be able to be guided on social justice issues in their church. At the same time, they said, but they don't want their pastors to be political. There is a difference between social justice advocacy and political activism, right? Again, so when I think of political activism, I'm thinking of getting, as Liz said, no, it's not about who you vote for, telling you who to vote for and campaigning for any particular person. That's different from social justice activism or being socially just and upholding socially just values. That's what Christianity presumably is about, so that we can advocate for social justice, right? Without particularly advocating for a particular political candidate. And so that what we want to do is help our congregants and those people around us understand what it means to value the sacred humanity of another. And so we can make that distinction. You don't have to talk politics in order to talk social justice, which is the gospel.
That's awesome. So I'm going to jump in on a couple more questions, and then probably Kelly will come right back. But I want to speak to this question of that I saw about counter narrative and what is a compelling counter narrative. It's part of the reason I was trying to start some of my conversation with this question of the Bible. Right? I mean, there's a very compelling counter narrative starting in Genesis and going all the way through Revelation, and it's an arc of justice. That when the people are being held in captivity and enslavement in Egypt, then there's an exodus, and God provides manna and says that oppression and enslavement are not okay. When there is inequality and suffering in that society, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there is a counter narrative of organizing society around everybody in, nobody out, around lifting from the bottom so that everybody rises. And there isn't a space for superiority, for nationalism. When we have the prophets, we hear, let justice roll down like water, or what does God require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. I mean, I really believe, this narrative arc of our sacred texts is one that is a counter narrative to a narrative of exclusionary, of patriarchy, of racism, of domination, and of authoritarianism. And again, I think often we should start with that inaugural sermon of Jesus, and we should hear the Lord's Prayer and the prayer that Jesus teaches us, on earth as it is in heaven. Forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. This is a counter vision. But if we also want to look more contemporarily, and not just to our scriptures, we have stories of people coming together in small town Indiana, across race, across gender, across all these different historic lines that divide, and building community together, and saying, we are all together in some kind of beloved community, not as some kind of kumbaya moment where everyone just holds hands and says we're all the same, but actually a unity in our diversity, an inclusion without exception, but without also erasing all the differences of our society and of our cultures. And so I have found that is a deeply compelling story for people, that people do believe that the moral issues of our day are healthcare and living wages and the right for people to kind of thrive and not just barely survive. And I think that when we hear that in the public square, people respond. And so I want to take one more question that I also saw earlier on in the chat. I'm trying to find it now, because there are so many comments right now, which is awesome. But let me see if I can find it. Sorry. So it was the question about that in the New York Times, that David French writes of Christian nationalism as Christians wanting political supremacy, and how do we kind of identify ourselves not just as we're not them, and I think that this is linked to the kind of putting out a moral vision, because I think that if all we hear kind of in the public square is a theology of exclusion and of hate, and of kind of control, that it's, we don't have to just say not that. We can call people in to the kind of society that we believe is possible and that we are prepared to organize towards. So I have spent many years, I've spent 3 decades of my life doing very grassroots anti-poverty organizing. And almost a week goes, there's almost not a week that goes by where someone doesn't come up to me, a person of faith or a person not of faith, saying, I don't know why you're talking about trying to end poverty, because don't you know the Bible says the poor will be with you always. And so for many years, I just tried to say, no, it doesn't say that, right? I just tried to push back and say, no, I don't like that. No, no, no. And then I started to actually interpret those Bible passages in community with people and say, but what does the Bible say? What does that passage even say? It says that if we cancel debts and pay workers a living wage and organize society around the needs and demands of people who are the least of these, who are most of us, then your whole society will flourish. And that is something that isn't just about cursing the darkness, but it's about inviting people and showing and shining a light on what is possible. And I really believe our best way of countering white Christian nationalism theologically, religiously, is by talking about the core and center of what our faith traditions and what Christianity and the Bible really says.
Yeah, thank you for that, Liz, because I agree with that, and it takes me to a couple of other questions or comments in the chat as well, and so I'll reflect on those as you look for others there. And let me start sort of where Liz left off. There's a question as well in the chat about Christian engagement as opposed to Christian engagement in the public square, and what is Christian nationalism, sort of the difference. And I think, again, there is a difference. And even as the distinction that Liz was making in relation to David French's article, which I confess that I've not read, again, so can't talk about that in a nuanced way. But this is what I can say, is that there is a difference between Christian engagement on the public square and Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism, by definition, is, as we said before, exclusive. Christian nationalism, by definition, is oppositional. Christian nationalism, by definition, is saying, my religion's better than your religion. We the best, everyone got to be, and in fact, we're the only religion. Our God is the only God. Now, here's what we know. I'm going to borrow something from Howard Thurman, and then I'll go back to what the difference is with Christian engagement. Yeah, Howard Thurman said this. He said, you know what? What we have to think of when we think of the world of religions, right, which reflects the diversity of God's creation, and God's creation on no level is God's creation a dualistic binary creation. It is rich and complex and diverse and never sort of either or. It's no aspect of it. So and that's why we have a world of religions. And so Howard Thurman says this. He says, think of it at like a room with many doors. Right. The object is to get inside the room. Inside the room is that which Christians call God, and others call God, and others call some other kind of transcendent being. Now, if you sit and outside the room and your little door, you go through the door that's best for you to get inside the room. I'm not going to make anyone else come through my door. That might not be the best door for them. But you go through the door that is best for you, and the object is to get inside the room. Now, what can keep you from getting inside the room? When you stand outside the room and you look at your door and say, my door's better than your door, and you worship your door. And while you're worshiping your door, you still don't get inside the room. Inside the room where there's a God that we say is a God of love, a God that moves us closer to a more just world, a more just future. Christian nationalism makes their door, which is Christianity, God. Christian nationalism makes, as Liz started out, their door a false idol. And, and so it becomes idolatrous because you're worshiping your door. Now, look what happens with the Christian nationalist narrative. They never talk about justice. They never, it becomes this narrative that is a narrative of hate. They never get into the room where there's a God that is just, where there is a God that is love. Why? Because they're sitting there worshiping the door their door of what they claim to be the God of Jesus Christ. But the point is they never get there. And so have made that door a false idol. Now, so Christian nationalism never gets really to the Christian part, right? It's made the nationalist part a religion, the white nationalist part of religion. So what does Christian engagement look like? Well, it looks like not running around saying, oh, come with me, my door's better than your door. It looks like going out and doing the work, engaging in the world as your Christian values would tell you to engage. And that means it always motivated out of love to move people toward a more just world and society. So Christian engagement is not about preaching your religion. Christian engagement is about living into what you have been called to do, which is the gospel. That is, and the gospel is nothing more than the good news that the way things aren't the way they are supposed to be and are gonna be. So we're gonna move toward a more just future. For all the Episcopalians on this network, that's what the presiding bishop called us into a long time ago. The Jesus movement, it means moving, following Jesus in the world, doing justice. That's Christian engagement. How do we engage the world? How do we engage the world, moving it closer to the just future that God has promised us all? The last question I'll take is, how do we engage? Someone put a question, do you bring, I think I saw Tucker Carlson into the room when we talk about talking across differences and learning from one another? We do have to learn how to talk across differences. We do have to learn how to learn from one another. We cannot be in echo chambers in which we are only, that's how things like Christian nationalism really take root, when people are only listening to people who are just like themselves. So we can't, even quote unquote progressives can't stay in echo chambers. But what do you do? It's like, well, I don't want to talk to some of these people on the far right. Here's my rule of thumb, that, we can engage with anybody who respects the humanity of everybody, right? That's a big threshold. If you can respect the humanity, the sacred humanity of everybody, then we can begin a conversation. It's hard to begin a conversation with people who don't even respect your humanity, let alone someone else's sacred humanity. If we can conclude that all people who have breath are sacred human beings whose humanity needs to be respected, then we can begin to create a world together that indeed does that. And that begins, and then I'll shut up, Liz, I promise. So what's the sort of threshold for that? For me, the threshold for that is this: how do we create a world together that is going to respect the sacred humanity of everybody? Well, I always say, ask yourself, not, we have the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I like to reverse it. Don't withhold from another that which you would not want withheld from yourself. So ask yourself, what do I not want withheld from myself? I always give people, raise your hand. Does everyone want health care? Yeah. Does everyone want a decent home to live in? Oh, yeah. Does everyone want enough food on the table to eat? Yeah. Does everyone want to be able to go out of their house and be respected as a human being and not feel unsafe because of the way, the color of your skin, the way in which you were gendered or not gendered, to the language you speak? Does everyone want to be able to feel safe just for who they are? Everyone, yeah. Then don't withhold from another that which you would not want withheld from yourself, and then go about creating a world and a society that does not withhold from another that which you would not want withheld from yourself. That's the beginning of respecting the sacred humanity of every single human being. And that does start with someone who asks. That does start with being engaged on the local, yes, being engaged in vote locally, be aware of who the judges are on your ballots and all of that kind of thing. And as you vote, no matter what you do, who you vote for, keep in mind, we want to create a world, a society, a community in which we are developing a society, world, and community where we are not withholding from another that which we would not want withheld from ourselves. And that is Christian engagement as opposed to Christian nationalism.
That is a word. I love that. So 2 more real quick things, and then I'm going to throw it back to Kelly to close this out. But I saw a couple of questions, a couple of comments about, is this about left and right, Democrat or Republican? And what we say at the Kairos Center, what we say in the Poor People's Campaign, A National Call for Moral Revival, is that those divides are just too puny, especially when we're talking about the God of history. That we're talking about right versus wrong, not right versus left. And what is at the core, at the center of our faith traditions and of what it is to be a good human. And that when we actually put these dichotomies out there, these political ones, that we're making God tiny, and the God that created the whole universe is far from that, and that therefore we should be faithful to the concerns and the demands that God put before God's people, and those are concerns about justice. I saw in the chat also that arc that I was doing doesn't stop when we hit Paul. What is central in Paul's letters is this collection for the poor, is this justice from below, and in fact, more than Paul talking about justification by faith, not works of the law, is this idea of mutual solidarity amongst people. It's there more. It's there. It's of more concern in his letters. It's in all of his letters. And I think that this question of justice and always justice is what we have to keep our minds on. And so I think the last thing I would say, and then I'm going to throw it back, is about this question also, is when we call folk white Christian nationalists, are folk really Christian? Now, there are people that self-identify as Christian and are putting out this this theology and this politic. But I do also agree with the challenge in there, which is that if you want to look at what's at the core and the center of our sacred texts and traditions, it is very different from. In fact, it might be what Paul describes as anathema to, this kind of idolatry of a superiority and nationalism and hate, and that in fact, if we want to have faith of Jesus, not just the faith in Jesus, then we know what we're supposed to do, which is organize society around Jesus's main concerns. Traveling around the countryside, never charging a leper a copay, making sure that everyone's in and nobody's out. And I think that is what we're asked to do. So Kelly, I'm going to throw it to you to finish us out. But it's great to be with folks.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. It is I always learn and am enriched by our conversations together and the work that we do together. And I thank all of you for being here. As we are at the top of the hour, I will wrap it up simply this way. And that is, it is not our job, I think, to call others Christian or not Christian. It is our job to be Christian, to live into the faith as we understand it. And that faith always begins with justice. And so I say, as we know from Micah, and I will leave it this way, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And if we do that, then we will provide a counter narrative to white Christian nationalism. I'll stop there.